Hi, and thank you for tuning into the Nature Conversations podcast. I'm Dr. Adam Forbes. I'm a forest ecologist who specialises in the restoration of New Zealand's forest ecosystems. This podcast isn't about me, however. The purpose of the Nature Conversations podcast is to capture knowledge and insights from remarkable people and to profile important issues for ecology and nature conservation. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Mike Marden. Mike brings more than 40 years of experience studying landscapes through the lenses of geology and geomorphology, with a particular focus on erosion processes, vegetation dynamics, and land management. We explore Mike's research journey and unpack the key drivers of erosion, what causes it, how it accelerates, and why some landscapes are more vulnerable than others. A major focus of our conversation is the critical role vegetation plays in stabilising landforms and mitigating erosion at both site and catchment scale. Drawing on decades of field research and practical observation, Mike shares candid insights about common mistakes in erosion control strategies and why we continue to repeat them. He offers practical advice for landowners, discusses the importance of long-term thinking, and highlights the powerful connection between vegetation management, pest control, and sustainable landscape outcomes. This episode is rich with science, real-world experience, and straightforward guidance for anyone interested in better land stewardship and erosion resilience.
I think there's been a mistake in not realising at an early stage that Indigenous reversion has a role to play in this whole saga of dealing with erosion, not only existing erosion, but in mitigating further erosion in years ahead. There's a lot more pastoral land that needs to go into some sort of protective vegetation cover. And we know from past experience that natural reversion, Manuka and Kānaka, is really quite quick, and we know it's effective. And so, and be cost effective as well. Yes, just let these areas revert. And with a bit of weed and pest control, we would solve a lot of the erosion problems for the areas that still need treatment. We are now seeing that where forests have been established for a protection purpose, and then they become commercial and harvested, we see the response of increased landsliding in these forested areas. So there's a learning there that we have to be careful where we put these forests, and to some extent, if it could be managed to perhaps not harvest such big areas at one time and at the time of the year when it's most likely to get the most significant rainfall events.
I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Mike Marden to the Nature Conversations podcast. How are you today, Mike?
Oh, very well, thank you.
Thanks very much for joining me. Mike, can you tell us a little bit about your journey, what drew you into geomorphology in the first place?
Yep. When I was at high school, I always had a fascination with landscapes. And out of all the subjects taught in those days, my favourite was always physical geography. And unfortunately, there was only a smattering of geology taught. So when I went to uni, I decided the first subjects I were going to enroll in were geography and geology. It wasn't really until I completed a PhD at Massey that I realised that this was where my interest lay. At Massey, I was contracted to investigate the relationships between erosion and geology in the southern Ruahine Range. And the issue there was that within the steep terrain, multiple storm events over many years had initiated shallow landslides. And this resulted in the accumulation of gravel within the stream channels, which was then being transported beyond the range and infilling the stream beds, draining through farmland, and it obviously causing a problem. So one of the main findings of my research was that the slopes had become increasingly vulnerable to the initiation of shallow landslides during successive storms. And this was due to the poor state of the canopy of the indigenous trees and the lack of understory vegetation. So in other words, finding was that feral pests had caused a decline in the overall stream health of the trees, which reduced the effectiveness of the trees to mitigate the initiation of shallow landslides, hence the oversupply of gravel. Now, I'm not sure that any of my findings were adopted in any particular way, other than I do believe the mapping of the bedrock through the Manawatu Gorge may have been used to assess the vulnerability of the gorge road to future landslides.
Thank you, Mike. That's so interesting. It's so interesting to hear the linkage between vegetation cover and the integrity of it and pests and filtering right through to river health and gravel supply and things. That's very interesting. So you had quite a long career with Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research, as I understand it. What were the big land management challenges facing New Zealand at that time when you were getting involved with this and as a professional scientist?
My first appointment was actually with the New Zealand Forest Research Institute to similarly investigate relationships between erosion and geology, but this time in Tairāwhiti, where obviously the bedrock is much younger and more susceptible to erosion than in the Ruahenis, and to different types of erosion, including very deep-seated failures such as earth flows and rotational slumps, and also to gullying. So similar to the situation in the Ruahenis, the problem was the oversupply of sediment derived from the eroding upper catchment basins, infilling the river channels in the lower reaches of the major rivers, and this was contributing to increased incidence of flooding of the valuable cropland on the Poverty Bay Flats. So the solution back in those days, of course, was to plant extensive areas of severely eroding farmland with fast-growing exotic tree species. So the research questions when I arrived in the region were whether or not these plantings had stabilized the land and reduced the supply of sediment, and if so, what was the science explanation, and could the differences in extent of erosion pre and post afforestation actually be quantified? So the initial focus of my research was to document the successes and failures of exotic afforestation as an erosion control strategy. In later years, this led to my interest in the potential of using indigenous species instead.
Thanks, Mike. For listeners without a science background, what actually causes slopes to fail?
First of all, you have to know what type of slope failure you're dealing with. There's a wide range of landslide types, largely based on the depth and the mode of failure. So the most common forms of erosion in Tairāwhiti are landslides, which, as the name implies, failure occurs along a sliding surface deep within the soil. Some failures occur at a shallow depth, and as the word implies, these are called shallow landslides. But when failure occurs at greater depths, these failures are known as earth flows and slumps. But those are not the only sorts of erosion we're dealing with here. It's another process that's called fluvial erosion, and this results in the scouring of channels along watercourses during flood events. And the most common form of fluvial erosion is bank erosion and gullying. Now, what causes them? Most of the common triggers, the most common trigger of slope failure is actually rainfall. Most of the erosion processes on hillsides occur when there is sufficient rainfall to saturate the soil. If the soils are thin, they become saturated very quickly, and shallow landslides fail usually within the duration of a particular storm event. So it's almost an instantaneous response. In contrast, it takes longer for the greater mass of the deeper failures, such as earth flows and slumps, to reach saturation. So signs of slope movement in response to rainfall may not become obvious for several weeks or even months after each storm has passed. Another trigger, less common of course, are earthquakes. But in the past, these have triggered some of the largest landslides that we know of, and many of which have dammed rivers and resulted in the creation of lakes, such as Lake Waikaremoana. Then there's bank undercutting. It's another process where slopes adjacent to streams and rivers are prone to collapse when undercut during periods of high flow, such as during storms, or they collapse once the river levels have dropped after the storm has passed. And in this case, it's the saturated bank materials that simply fail by gravity alone. Then there's a human influence. Removing a well-established vegetation cover increases the likelihood of slopes collapsing, as was the case during the early European settlers when they felled extensive areas of indigenous forest from erosion-prone hill slopes and converted it to farmland. And we're still dealing with some of those problems today. Then the situation where people cut roads or tracks across a slope, which often destabilizes the slope above the road, and then the area above the road collapses onto the road. So that's a major problem for lots of areas along State Highway 35 in particular. Then there's a practice of directing increased volumes of surface water runoff from roads into already unstable parts of the landscape, for example, onto existing earth flows. And this increases the chances, of course, of reactivating these features.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for explaining that so clearly. It all makes a lot of sense. So where do plants and plant roots come into the story? I mean, what are they doing underground that we don't see?
So vegetation has an influence in two ways. Firstly, at the time when the crowns of adjacent trees touch, and we refer to this time as canopy closure, approximately, and based on rainfall figures for this region, 30% of the total annual rainfall is actually intercepted by the canopy, and it's evaporated back into the atmosphere. Then, of course, of the rainfall that does actually reach the forest floor and soaks into the soil, the amount of water extracted via the tree roots and transpired back into the atmosphere is equivalent to another 30% of that total annual rainfall. So adding those two figures together over the course of a year, and given normal climatic conditions, a closed canopy forest can reduce the soil water content by at least 60%. And that significantly reduces the potential for slopes under a forest to fail. So conversely, in non-forested areas, the soils are more likely to reach saturation more frequently, hence the incidence of slope failure in areas of pastoral hill country is greater than in areas established in woody vegetation. Secondly, the roots reinforce the soil by binding with soil particles. When root systems of individual trees overlap, and we refer to this as having attained full root occupancy of the soil, they strengthen the soil. And in combination with the reduced soil moisture levels, soils are less likely to reach saturation and fail. So an example of the combined influences of closed canopy and soil reinforcement processes in reducing the incidence of landslides, and I'm drawing from a significant storm event, Cyclone Bowler in '88, it was established that under a closed canopy indigenous forest and also under a canopy of advanced shrubland, such as Manuka and Karnika, and stands of exotic pines older than 8 years, there were 16 times fewer landslides within those forested areas than occurred on adjacent pastured hill slopes. So that's a significant reduction in landslide incidence simply by having those vegetation covers on the hillsides. In contrast to that, in areas where we had indigenous shrubland or 6 to 8 year old exotic pines where the canopy had not closed at that time of the storm, we got a intermediate level of protection against landslide occurrence, whereas in areas where the pines were less than 5 years old, they provided no greater reduction in landslide occurrence than pasture. What that's telling us is that it's critical for vegetation to reach that canopy closure status before you start to see a significant reduction in landslide occurrence.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's really interesting. Can I just ask you another question? You talk about root occupancy and canopy closure, and I understand that. Do you think that there's a factor in what you're talking about in terms of the vertical structure of the forests? Like in terms of you might have a canopy, then a sub-canopy, then a really intact sapling and seedling tiers, so that there's more opportunities for rainfall interception and evaporation and maybe more evapotranspiration. Do you think the structure of the forest underneath the canopy is also part of the picture?
Yes, absolutely. I seem to recall in another study, we actually measured the interception of rainfall, not only from the canopy, but from the understory species. And that seemed to indicate that having that extra layer or multiple layers of vegetation under the closed canopy significantly reduced the soil water content, even more than just having the a single story closed canopy.
So are there particular root traits that make plants better at stabilizing slopes?
Yes. But when we looked at the root systems of individual species, and this is exotic and native, there were huge variations, both in the size, diameter, classes of the roots, the depth that roots penetrate into the soil, the distance that roots spread out from the stem, and even the direction that the roots grow relative to slope. So, upslope, cross slope, downslope. And I guess some of the graphic examples were where we grew these plants on a flat surface, then the root systems tend to be more evenly spread around the stem, but their distribution on for trees planted on steep slopes tended to be more in an upslope and a cross slope, with fewer roots extending downslope. So this seemed to be some sort of adaptation to maximizing the stability of the tree by having more roots grow in those directions rather than down slope direction. So you look at different trees of the same species, and the root dimensions and structure can be quite different. And it's because of these other site factors. Another one is water table. If you're planting trees in an area that has consistently higher water table, so that means there's a lot of water just below the ground surface, then that stunts root development. So it's in the root systems of a tree that may normally put down reasonably deep root systems. They become stunted, and the roots instead don't develop very much mass, or they remain shallow, and we call it plate-like. So they're very shallow and spread out horizontally. And that, of course, increases their susceptibility to things like wind throw or topple. Another factor is soil depth. Is there sufficient soil for the trees to develop their normal tap-rooted system, for example, cabbage tree, that is in fact capable of anchoring a tree to a slope? But if it can't develop those deep taproot systems, then again, they become vulnerable to other processes like wind throw. Some species have what you might call a very fibrous dominated root system. So high root mass, but they're all very small in diameter and tend to be concentrated close to the stem rather than being widespread. Whereas other species have long, spindly, lateral tap roots that stick pretty much to the surface and don't necessarily develop a lot of fibrous roots or roots to any great depth. And an example is that, for example, if you think of Manuka, Carnica, and Toot, they have a very high proportion of fibrous and small diameter roots, which incidentally are particularly well adapted to colonizing harsh sites. They're usually the first species to come back on landslide scars where the soils are very thin and there's very limited soil moisture storage, but they survive. Then there's factors like planting density. Obviously, the higher the plant density, the greater is the root mass and spread and get the roots interlocking. Then the greater is the area that you've got good soil root reinforcement. So the probability of preventing or at least mitigating slope failure is greater the higher the density of the plants. The higher the density means they're planted closer together.
So how long does it realistically take at let's say a denuded site, a site that's been cleared of vegetation, how long does it realistically take before vegetation starts making a difference to stability?
Number of factors here. Have to take into account that different species grow at different rates, both in terms of height, root development, canopy closure, etc., etc. Planting density has a huge influence on the time it takes to achieve canopy closure and good root reinforcement. So the higher the density, the quicker is the combined influence of both canopy closure and root reinforcement in mitigating slope failure. Whether plants are evergreen or deciduous is also important, because evergreen species transpire and intercept rainfall all year round. Deciduous trees, not so much. They're pretty dormant during at the time when they lose their leaves. Again, going back to site factors, which affect growth rates. This might include things like soil depth. Shallow soils, the plants aren't going to grow so well. Deep, rich soils, they grow very well. Things like altitude, high altitude, the rate's slow. Slope steepness, the steeper the slopes, that affects the root growth, tree development overall. Slope aspect, that's another one. Trees grow faster and better on the sunny slopes with sunny aspect. Drainage is yet another factor. If you've got high water tables, that affects root development, that stumps tree growth. Whereas if you've got free draining soils, for example, coated with volcanic ash, 50 centimeters deep, then the trees grow magnificently well. So all of those factors influence the timing and success and failure of plantings, both in the control of existing erosion and the mitigation of erosion during future storms. And then for new plantings, there's other factors. The management of weeds and pests ultimately determine whether the effort and the cost of establishing these plantings has been worthwhile or not.
So I just wanted to ask you a few questions, more of like an applied sense, practical sense, and bringing your knowledge into these questions would be really helpful. If a landowner is dealing with erosion today, what's the first thing you'd want them to understand?
The most important thing I think would be to understand the type of erosion that is warranting treatment. Most landowners will know pretty much what's caused the erosion and how it's developed over time. Some of them have their own opinions, of course, and some of them can be quite wrong. It would help to explain exactly the science behind why the erosion has occurred and what's led to its development, and what can happen if it's not dealt with at an early stage. There are too many instances in this region where erosion has gone uncontrolled, and it's basically got to the point where it's become too big a problem, and there is actually no known vegetative treatment that is capable of fixing the problem. And I'm referring in particular to the huge gullies we have in this region, that they will literally just run their course, and you'd be wasting money trying to mitigate them getting any bigger. And the Forest Service found this when they established huge areas of exotic pine plantations in the hope that they would stabilize these gullies, but that was not to be the case. And a lot of these gullies, if they had been treated at the time of the clear felling of the indigenous forests, which was back in the 1880s to 1920s, we may well have been able to do something about them getting any bigger. But because they remained untreated, they were developing faster than the vegetation could establish. They've just grown beyond a size now where it's impractical, futile to even try to stabilize them. And as was the case in the past and remains today, these features are a significant source, the most significant source of sediment, and they will be well into the future. I would like, I think, to provide the landowner options available to him where options will obviously work. They also need to understand that in many of these restoration programs, reforestation, whatever you want to call it, there's going to be a requirement for fencing, to keep pests and weeds out. In many cases, it's some of the landscape is almost impossible to find a stable enough area to put a fence. And so that adds to the complexity of trying to restore a lot of these sites. I guess that they need to be informed of how realistic the plantings might be, how long it might take. They're going to have to understand that weed and pest control is going to be critical to the success or failure of the plantings, and so it comes down to their realization that they're part of the solution, and they need to be committed to the program of work.
Thanks, Mike. That sounds excellent. Just, I've got a question on what you were saying, and we were referring to the very, developed slips, I guess you'd say, the really problematic slips that have just running their own course. Is the issue there, in the context of what you've described to me, that the ground is so eroded and so degraded that root occupancy can't be achieved? Is that really the crux of it?
A lot of it goes back to the fact that we're dealing with what we call soft rock terrain. It's mudstone dominated. In lots of places it's being tectonically crushed, faulted, broken up. It's got next to no strength, and if you get concentrated water draining on these slopes, they just literally turn to mud, and you fail, and they fail at the slopes fail at such a rate that no form of vegetation can germinate and survive long enough to make any difference. So it's the speed at which these features are developing that is the problem, and it's a soft rock terrain that makes it so easy for water to carve into the hill slopes. And the problem just exacerbates.
What mistakes do you see people make when planting for erosion control?
The classic, I guess, was the adoption of large-scale monoculture exotic forest plantings. I think in concept it was good, and it has worked in many places, but also made the mistake of planting the wrong species in the wrong place, and that's led to a lot of our problems when we're dealing with woody debris. Following storms, trees topple into these large-scale erosion features, and they end up coming down the rivers and ending up on our beaches. If we thought a bit more about where we planted those pines and where we didn't, I think we would have had greater protection value and less of the issues we're dealing with, the cleanup, the cost of cleanup of the woody debris. And by the same time, if we kept the timber species to the less erodible areas of land, there would have been far higher profits for the forest industry, and they could have avoided all the cost of cleanup. So a lack of planning, I think you would say, right at the beginning, before adopting a knee-jerk reaction and just planting one species everywhere instead of thinking about which species would be better in which parts of the landscape. So yeah, lack of planning. Yeah. Oh, I think there's been a mistake in not realizing at an early stage that Indigenous reversion has a role to play in this whole saga of dealing with erosion, not only existing erosion, but in mitigating further erosion in years ahead. There's a lot more pastoral land that needs to go into some sort of protective vegetation cover. And we know from past experience that natural reversion, Manuka and Karnika, is really quite quick, and we know it's effective. And so, and be cost effective as well. Yes, just let these areas revert, and with a bit of weed and pest control, we would solve a lot of the erosion problems for the areas that still need treatment. I guess another mistake has been the planting of tall conservation trees in a situation where they're A, unlikely to be effective, and B, although unintended, the tall trees planted along riverbanks, such as the poplars and willows, which were left unmanaged, are eventually, and as proven to be the case, falling into stream banks and gullies. And they now make up quite a significant component of the woody debris found in our river systems and on the beaches. So it's not all pine trees, it's these other conservation trees that established with the right intent, but in situations where bank undercutting in particular was always going to result in the collapse of these trees into the river waterways. Again, in hindsight, if we'd used native vegetation in those areas, and even if it was lost, the trees of small stature, it wouldn't have been such a big woody debris problem, if you like. So, and they would regenerate themselves probably without having to be replanted, even if the banks of the rivers did fail. Another one, sometimes we plant species in areas that are at constant risk of flooding and silt deposition, and that's turns out to be a waste of time. Some tree species can survive siltation, flooding, other trees can't. And we're seeing quite a significant loss of both indigenous and exotic tree species in areas where the forest floor is just being inundated with silt, and that basically cuts off the air supply to the root systems, and so the soils become anaerobic, and the trees die. Another mistake, I think that a lot of the conservation plantings don't take into account that species grow at different rates. So, that's their canopy and their root systems. And if you plant fast-growing species next to a slow-growing species, one suppresses the other. And there are quite significant losses and unnecessary expense. Whereas if they'd thought about the spacing and the adjacency of which species you plant next to each other, and realize that the slower growing species need more room to grow, whereas the fast growing species will, if they're planted too close together, they'll suppress the slower growing ones. So, and you see it along these highway plantings, all sorts of species planted so close together, it's unbelievable. And you go back 5 years later and you notice that half of them are not there anymore. And that, to me, that seems like an awful waste of money. Anyway, but that's a personal opinion.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you a few questions now from your own perspective. If you could pass on one key insight onto the next generation of land managers or scientists, what would it be?
To have a greater knowledge than they currently have of the influence of the combined geologic processes. I'm talking about tectonics and the nature of the bedrock, of climatic factors that combine predispose different areas to different erosion processes that have in the past actually sculpted the landscape that we see today. And those processes are ongoing. Those features are in the landscape and they fail by the same mechanisms under the same conditions that were in the past affect them today. So they are the principal drivers of why we see repeated episodes of erosion occurring in the very same locations time and time again. So you really have to think about, if you're going to implement some sort of erosion control strategy, you have to think of what's going to happen long term, knowing that these features are going to fail under certain conditions. It may not be for decades. It takes particularly harsh storm events, for example, like Cyclone Bowler, Hail, Gabriel, to trigger a lot of these things, and they can remain stable for decades. But you really do need to think about your vegetation strategies, if you like, if you're trying to control or mitigate these features from failing in the future.
Thanks, Mike. It sounds like great advice. From your own perspective, what has been your most interesting learning?
Right. That it takes a series of disastrous storm events before decades of research on erosion processes and their mitigation is actually sought after. Yeah. It's all suddenly come to the fore as a consequence of the two latest storms. But, we've had storms in the past, perhaps not as severe, but the results have always been the same. And it's been the uptake of the research findings has been really slow, and we keep making the same mistakes time and time again.
And what has been your most memorable career moment?
It's not a single moment in time, but it stems more so really from the privilege of having spent 40 plus years of research in one region and the opportunity to actually document the influence of geology and climate in creating a complex landscape, and having the knowledge that this has been going on for tens of thousands of years, and then to be able to record differences in the erosion response to storm events, across different landscapes and multiple storm events, and basically to look at where vegetation has had a mitigating influence. In other words, where has it been successful? Where hasn't it been successful? and the reasons behind that. And then the opportunity to measure the erosion response in areas where we've actually felled the forests, and it's coincided with storm events. So, for example, we are now seeing that where forests have been established for a protection purpose, and then they become commercial and harvested, we see the response of increased landsliding in these forested areas. So there's a learning there that we have to be careful where we put these forests, and to some extent, if it could be managed to perhaps not harvest such big areas at one time and at the time of the year when it's most likely to get the most significant rainfall events. So overall, I'm hopeful that the learnings gained from the successes and failures of the past in terms of erosion mitigation efforts will hopefully serve as guidelines, because we still have an enormous task ahead of us in the treatment of very extensive parts of this region in particular, where it's not only existing erosion, but we need to think about how we're going to future-proof remaining parts of the area against future storm events.
I'm interested, is there a moment in your career that really stands out as being the most memorable moment?
No. No, I can't think of one, to be honest. I guess the only other thing I could add is I have partaken in workshops and advisory groups, which is really gratifying, and being able to add some insights into what this region is faced with in terms of erosion, and how we're going to have to go about trying to fix the problems in areas where it is fixable. And yeah, just provide advice as best I can, in the hope that somebody will take it on board and just learn from the past and not to make the same mistakes.
Thanks, Mike. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the listeners before we wrap up?
Just be aware that there is a lot of research out there, and I'm talking specifically about the issues that I have been discussing on this podcast. And to if you think you've got, particularly landowners, if you think you've got erosion issues, to do a bit of background reading, research, see what's out there. There's lots of avenues where you can source this sort of information. And again, I think I'd advise, well, in many cases, landowners will be obliged to go to their local councils and seek assistance and knowledge from them, use their experience in coming up with a solution to dealing with their erosion problems.
Thanks, Mike. I just want to thank you for your amazing contribution to science. I hope your work receives the attention that it deserves, both now and in the future. And thanks very much for joining me and sharing your experience with the listeners. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anytime.
As you've just heard, there's nothing simplistic about erosion, and there's certainly no one-size-fits-all solution. After more than 40 years of studying landscapes, Mike reminds us that many of our biggest problems haven't come from bad intentions, they've come from poor planning. Planting the wrong species in the wrong place, reacting quickly instead of thinking long-term, treating landscapes as uniform when they are anything but. Whether it's large-scale monocultures on highly erodible land, unmanaged poplars and willows collapsing into rivers, or conservation plantings that ignore species growth rates and flood risk, the common thread is a mismatch between vegetation and landscape process. But there's also a clear message of hope in this conversation. Indigenous reversion, smarter species selection, matching land use to land capability, allowing vulnerable pastoral land to return to protective cover, thinking not just about what we plant, but where, why, and what happens decades later. Mike's reflections are a powerful reminder that erosion control isn't just about stabilising soil. It's about understanding geomorphology, hydrology, ecology, and economics, and having the patience to work with the landscape rather than against it. If there's one takeaway from today, it might be this. The landscape keeps the receipts. Every decision shows up eventually, in woody debris, in clean-up costs, in lost plantings, or in resilience. The opportunity now is to stop repeating the same mistakes, to plan better, to think longer term, and to recognise the critical role vegetation, especially well-matched, well-managed vegetation, plays at a whole of landscape scale. A huge thank you to Mike for sharing his experience so candidly and generously. And thank you for listening. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with someone involved in land management, conservation or farming. These are the conversations that matter, and the more we understand our landscapes, the better stewards we can become.